I'm Dalton Dale, a music enthusiast on a mission to learn about my favorite genre, heavy metal. Join me as I listen through and learn about the history of heavy metal music. We'll be talking about bands, albums, songs, and historical events that helped create the metal music genre as we know it today. This is the Heavylution podcast. Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome to the Heavylution podcast. I am your host, Dalton Dale. It's good to be here this week. It's been a really good week personally and had a nice 3-day weekend. Did some fishing today. I hope you guys are all enjoying a nice 3-day weekend as well. And if not, I hope that you're at least enjoying your weekend or did enjoy your weekend. As you all know, I am covering the history of heavy metal, and if you didn't know, now you know. If you're new to the series, this is going to be a good episode for you to jump into, as I am going to be taking a little bit of a break from doing my normal album listening and artist discovery, which is sort of the standard format for my episodes. And I'm going to be really talking through a transitionary period here. I started this journey and go all the way back to the roots of heavy metal, back to Black Sabbath, into new wave of British heavy metal, early American traditional heavy metal, video, a little bit of video metal. And last week we covered Metallica's Kill 'Em All album. It's their debut full-length album released in 1983, and it had a really major impact on heavy metal music, especially in the United States, but beyond as well. And what I wanted to talk through, and as I mentioned in last week's episode, is the impact that this album plays on the early thrash metal scene and power metal scene of the 1980s, early to mid 1980s. You see, Metallica wasn't the first to do it by any means, and Metallica wasn't even maybe the best to do it. But Metallica, and why I wanted to start with the album Kill 'Em All, was I feel like one of the early bands to help pioneer and bring popularity to the genre. And I think that's what differentiates a lot of what Metallica did in their early years and what some other bands did, because this is a really young band who came out on the scene and just lit a fire. They put out the Kill 'Em All album. Originally, they put out a single, Hit the Lights, on Metal Massacre Volume 1, discovered by Ron Quintana and Brian Slagle, and put that out. And that was where they got discovered, and ultimately put out this full length, and it really had a massive impact on the music scene at the time. There were a lot of other impacts and a lot of other factors that went into play as far as the power metal and thrash metal and speed metal community. And I'm just going to discuss a little bit about that today as sort of a transition into where I will be focusing more on power metal. This episode so aptly titled, I've Got the Power Metal. And just talk a little bit about what defines power metal to be what it was, that separates it from traditional heavy metal, and that helped, you know, spin off and really, create these other branches of heavy metal music. So you've got the new wave of British heavy metal, which is really marked and characterized by the fact that they really honed in and defined sound for heavy metal as a whole. Prior to this, there was just a lot of hard rock, 1970s hard rock, and there was some bands that kind of verged on heavy metal with more distorted guitar riffs. There was more, high register melodic singing styles. There was some dueling guitar melody lines that were being written, and guitars harmonizing with each other. Those were all key elements of new wave of British heavy metal. Bands like Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Def Leppard, all really good examples of new wave of British heavy metal bands that helped pave the way and pioneer that sound. And then you kind of have what develops into traditional heavy metal style, which is all very similar of new wave of British heavy metal, except it's a little bit more of a polished framework for those bands of the time, and they're established a little bit more. They have really gotten a fan base that has come to expect a certain type of material from these bands. Even today, there's sort of a revival of traditional heavy metal, the new wave of traditional heavy metal that's happened in, I would say, the last 5 maybe 10 years, of bands that are really mimicking that early traditional sound. So this was a really, really impactful time for heavy metal as a whole. There is a lot of characteristics being developed within the sound and within the style of playing that ultimately become components and pieces of other parts and other subgenres of heavy metal as we move forward out of the late 1970s and into the early 80s. As you move out of the 70s and into the 80s, punk rock had its heyday in the late 70s, and it sort of begins to develop a little bit of an influence. You've got young musicians like Metallica, James Hetfield and Cliff and Lars and Dave Mustaine and Kirk Hammett and those guys, right? Amongst many other musicians who are growing up and are hearing a lot of this new wave of British heavy metal. They are hearing and getting a little bit familiar with some of the punk rock, and this ends up being the culmination of that ends up really playing into the development of power metal. Power metal is marked by a much speedier play style than new wave of British heavy metal and traditional heavy metal. There's a lot of double kick in the drum work. The guitar riffs focus on more driving riffs with palm muted effects versus more melodic and scale and harmony driven riffs. And some key elements of that, really being born out of the speed side of things. Now, Motorhead really first introduced a lot of that speed in the late 1970s on albums like Overkill and Ace of Spades. And, that was where bands like Metallica really took from, is that sound and that style. And even vocally, that was what James Hetfield, didn't consider himself a great singer. So he went with a gruffer sound and a gruffer vocal style like Lemmy that he felt more comfortable doing. Metallica didn't want that, so to speak. They actually were not sold on Hetfield being the vocalist, but they pressed on. If you go and you read about power metal and the things that define power metal, ultimately what ends up defining power metal as a genre as it gets more and more defined in the 1980s, where there there becomes more definition in the play style and the different components. It really ended up developing into something that was a little bit more. I don't want to say anthemic is the word that comes to my mind, but orchestral, or there was a lot of imagery involved, and there was just a lot of, for lack of a better term, power to the overall sound and style. There were more fantastic elements in the lyric, the lyricism and the elements that they were writing about. That was influenced from like Ronnie James Dio and Judas Priest and some of those guys, but musically it was faster. And I think what ends up becoming power metal, ends up that it's really a much cleaner playing style than what splits off from power metal and more thrash metal, where there's a less of an emphasis on, the cleanliness of notes or the cleanliness of the music itself, and really, is focused on more of the extreme side of power metal. There's a definitive divergence happening in the early to mid 80s of traditional heavy metal that really does birth power and thrash metal. And for me, this is where I can really start to hear and see elements of heavy metal that, really do have waves in and throughout heavy metal all through time. You really were kind of on a singular path up to this point, from Judas Priest, or from excuse me, Black Sabbath, up to early American heavy metal, Van Halen and Motley Crue and Quiet Riot and those guys, and then traditional heavy metal where you've got new wave of British heavy metal, gods and giants coming out with newer stuff. I I really feel like you were on sort of a singular path up to this point where every characteristic was still being really honed in on, and there wasn't really much of a split. Everything kind of came down one channel, with, really big focus on specific elements, whether that was in European traditional heavy metal or American traditional heavy metal. There was a lot of the same elements and themes, and I think once you get to power and thrash metal, that is where you really start to see a divergence and separation in play style, and these different elements and interpretations of these different elements that came from new wave of British heavy metal and that traditional heavy metal sound. Especially in the US, there was a period of time where uh, heavy metal magazines ended up making their way really, really big in the US. Tape trading became a lot more popular. It became a lot easier for newer styles and sounds of heavy metal music to gain traction. Younger crowds and younger generations were looking for, what is that next level thing out of the Van Halens and the Motley Crues and the Twisted Sister? What is the next level thing out of the Black Sabbaths and the Iron Maidens and the Judas Priests? They were, you know, I don't want to say worn out on those, because obviously those bands go on to create a massive following and achieve incredible success. So it's not that those bands were losing fans necessarily. It's just that tape trading and demo tapes for new young bands were getting out there, and it became a lot easier for the younger generation. The You're talking like mid to late teenage years of people who are circulating these demo tapes and circulating all of these different records throughout the United States through, ads in magazines and things like that, that really enable bands like Metallica. It enabled bands like, Exodus and Anthrax, and even some more popular European bands like Merciful Fate, or Raven, and bands like that really were able to make their way and gain some momentum in the United States. Magazines like Metal Mania, New Heavy Metal Review, and Kick Ass Monthly, all of those magazines were really trying to find that next big sound. They were really focused on trying to get away from the MTV heavy metal bands and try to see what was more underground. We talked about how with the early American heavy metal came a wave of video metal through the introduction of MTV to the population, and you had bands that started creating these really big graphic, music videos, and these are the Twisted Sisters and the Motley Crues and the Poisons and the Rats of the world, who really ended up developing a big following through commercial success from MTV. But because of that, then their sound and their style ended up being a lot more influenced by the more popular, crowd, the more radio crowd, and that ends up, in my opinion, I think it ends up diluting that traditional heavy metal sound a little bit, and that's really where you go back to more hard rock sound, and it just in the 80s, and there's just new elements to it because of where music has progressed from the 70s and into the 80s. And so these magazines that are being put out are really trying to hit underground bands, are really trying to find the up and coming bands that teenagers are going to latch on to, and that ends up playing a really really big a key piece into helping propel power metal bands, thrash metal bands into the spotlight, because these are bands that are doing something different. They're doing something new. They have a different style to them. And you have those magazines circulating at the time that Metallica is really taking off. They go on tour with Raven. They're, able to get out and start generating some buzz around heavy metal as a genre, and then next thing you know, it's one of those that's like, oh, okay, this is really popular. There's money attached to the popularity of it. How do we get on that train? And then everything kind of comes and follows with that. And with that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a sellout period here. This is just, you go read about, bands like Merciful Fate and Raven and some of those who are talking about their early tours in the States, and they're making next to no money. So this isn't necessarily where you've got bands who are selling out. You've got bands who are really just trying to get the sound and style out there of what they're writing, and the result of that becomes more commercial success for heavy metal bands as a whole. And I think it just is the wave of pop culture. I think with all of things that pop culture gravitates to, they're always looking for what's popular in the young crowd. At the time that I was coming up in high school, and this would have been 15 years ago or better now, in the early 2000s, there was this really huge peak of emo and screamo and music in pop culture. I remember waking up before high school one morning and turning on MTV to music videos when MTV still had music videos, and seeing an AFI video for Miss Murder, and Fallout Boy was gaining so much popularity. My Chemical Romance was seeing airplay and radio play. I mean, there's all of these bands that started out as these underground emo screamo scene bands. You can post hardcore. There's a lot of different subgenres within those bands, but all of these bands gained a ton of commercial success all of a sudden really quickly. And again, I think it's just that pop culture wave of trying to say, okay, what's next? What's the sound that people are looking for now? And then because of that, all of that happened as I was going through high school. Now, near the end of high school, that was when all of a sudden it was like the Mumford and Sons and the Lumineers and this like wave of hipster rock kind of became popular. And now we're back settled into a groove of where I feel like is, more rap and hip hop influence in the mainstream. But there is some emerging rock that's kind of coming out there where you've got MGK and some of these others. And so all of that to say is just that, back then these aren't bands that are selling out. They're just bands that are just riding this wave and doing what they're passionate about, and end up kind of seeing success because of that. You know, Marking this transition for power metal, bands are starting to emphasize their speed capabilities in both genres, really, power and thrash metal, and seeing who can get faster and faster. For young bands like Metallica and Anthrax, there was almost a competition to see who could play faster and better. And that, really it further fueled the pursuit of speed. And ultimately, the competition faded as those bands honed in on their own sound and style, and there was just a focus on honing their craft specifically. But early on, it was a predominant element to helping create power metal of the time. Additionally, through this time period, there's tons and tons of new small record labels that were popping up. and some existing ones that were starting to catch on because they had signed some bands like Metal Blade Records, where Brian Slagle took and signed Metallica, who ultimately passes them on to New Jersey's Megaforce Records, who ended up putting out the Kill 'Em All album. Uh, Brian Slagle unfortunately couldn't afford it. I talked about it a little bit on this last week's episode, but Brian Slagle was so it was such a small startup. He just didn't have the money to do it, and so Metallica ended up finding Megaforce, who had ultimately signed and then released the album on that. But Megaforce at the time had Raven, and so that was their big draw. And then Danish record label Roadrunner, who was famous for having Merciful Fate and King Diamond. And then finally, there ended up being some smaller offshoots of major labels like Island Records, who eventually ended up signing Anthrax when all of these early, power metal bands started to get some big record contracts. They ended up getting some of these sub labels of major labels, and some of those labels still exist today in some form or fashion. All of this is really just a way to get you introduced to what I'm going to be listening to on my journey to learn the history of heavy metal. I'm going to be going through and I'm going to be listening to early power metal entries from bands like Accept, Jag Panzer, Man of War, Raven, Sabotage, Anthrax, and maybe more, depending on how I'm feeling about it all, before I start to go down the path of thrash metal and early black metal. There was definitely a different path that bands in Europe were taking, that were deriving their music more from bands like Venom, who I haven't touched yet, but that ends up becoming early black metal and more extreme versions of heavy metal as we know it today. So, hopefully, this gives you a good feel for where we're at in the timeline. Hopefully, it gives you a good feel for some of the historical elements, as well as some of the key components of things happening at the time within the sort of music stratosphere at the time, that were really big key elements to bringing power metal, thrash metal, and creating this sort of divergence out of traditional heavy metal, and you know bringing these to the spotlight so that we have some of the heavy metal styles that we have today, like death metal and deathcore and metalcore and all of these other styles that end up becoming grandbabies and children and grandchildren of these early heavy metal roots. So thank you all for tuning in today. As always, I would really appreciate it if you would find me on socials. I've got a Facebook page, the Heavylution Podcast. I've also got a TikTok, Heavylution Pod. And if you would like, share, and subscribe wherever you can, it really, really helps. If you're listening to this, please leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. Those reviews are really, really critical to early podcast algorithms and can make a really big difference in where I get placed on charts. So I would really appreciate that as well. And there is a link in the Spotify description of the podcast that allows you to donate financially if you feel so inclined. My wife pitched the idea of some Heavylution podcast t-shirts the other day, so I'm kind of sitting and thinking about that. If you're interested, hit me up on socials and let me know if that's something you feel like you'd be interested in. I'll further explore that down the road. As always, thank you so much. I appreciate all of you. I hope you have an awesome week. We will see you next time.